So, fellow TNA fans, fellow TNA fans, have y'all gotten your pink TNA shirt yet? The manliest shirt of all time? If not, I highly recommend that you do. Seriously, it's for a good cause, it supports the company, and it's just too cool for school, alright? And speaking of school, well, what about you WWE fanboys, I know you get shoved in them lockers, dipped in them toilets at school, you should get one of these shirts, You know what you should do? You should go ahead and buy one of these pink babies, when it comes in, put it right on, march right into that school, go right up to those bullies and say, "Hey guys, look, this is my favorite shirt." And you know what those bullies will then do? They'll say, "Wow, I respect you now. Let's be friends." And then you won't have to live inside that locker anymore. Is that where you're talking to me from right now? Is that where you're typing your hater comments from right now? Do you have your little monitor, your little keyboard in there? Little Candice Michelle poster on the side? Buy one of these shirts, you won't have to be in there anymore. But, okay, if you're all grumpy and uncomfortable in there, as you always seem, fine. I'll try to finish up this video, wrap up before the school bell rings, and the teacher comes by and lets you out. That little joke intro was inspired by the following. A few weeks ago, a lot of my friends and I went to the movie theater, and I used to always talk about how you never see people in WWE gear anymore. Well, we saw one. This college-aged, 90-pound loser, right, with the big glasses, like the messed up teeth and the squeaky voice, with like the little chain gang headband, and like he had the mushroom hair, so the hair's like coming out the side, the Cena shirt on, that little chain gang spinny necklace, and he's just standing there, talking to this girl that works there, trying to impress her, and we're like standing in a line and we're just watching him, and this is what he says, alright? "For the last 2 years, I've been studying Taekwondo. So now when those big guys pick on me, I grab onto this amulet to remind myself to hold back on my power." Amulet! Alright. Now let's talk about TNA. We're sorry! We're sorry. Thank you for holding back on your power. We couldn't take the force. Alright, now let's talk about TNA. Now, though I admit some of the writing recently has been kind of iffy, alright, I love the concept of the main eventers versus the young guys, because not only does it have potential to be really exciting, it has potentials to make names out of a lot of people. And I don't understand all these people getting all bent out of shape, grabbing their amulets because the heel main event faction has been dominating. Of course they're dominating. They're the heel main event faction. Hitting on TNA right now because the heel main event faction is dominating is like hitting on a movie because 3/4 of the way through the bad guy's still winning. Of course the bad guy's winning. He's the bad guy. If the good guy wins, there's no movie. If the young guy wins, there's no story. What was one of the major criticisms of the WCW versus WWF storyline of 2001? It was that the heel WCW faction was never allowed to dominate. They were never allowed to look like a legitimate threat, so the storyline could never take off, and it flopped on its ass. Now here we have the heel MEM faction actually being allowed to dominate only for a few months, And these guys are getting all bent out of shape. Like, has the WWE made you completely forget about the concept of storyline building? These days everything needs to be fast and simple, right? Fast and simple. Survivor Series teams are announced. 2 weeks later, they fight. Boom, boom, done, right? The main event faction is formed. A month later, AJ beats him for the title. Wins, story over. Boom, boom, done, right? Is that how you want it? Is that how you want it? That's not how I want it. Because the faster and simpler something is, the smaller the payoff is. Right? If AJ walks into the Impact Zone tomorrow and beats Sting for the title, the story's over. And it's meaningless because the storyline was never allowed to mature. Right? Even in my Fantasy Ultimate Warrior storyline, I talked about the need for the Warrior to dominate no matter how much the instant gratification-minded fanboys complained about it because it was necessary for storyline purposes and payoff. Right? I love the way TNA set this up. Right? A team of experienced and organized former world champions beating the shit out of a bunch of unprepared, ill-equipped, and inexperienced young guys who at first are busy fighting amongst themselves, which allows them to get dominated even more, until former world champion Rhino marches in and tells them to get their act together and get organized before it's too late. I love that setup, right? Now, the writing since then has been a bit sloppy, and I'm not going to defend that. And here's what I would have done differently, all right? I would have had Rhino lead the front line against the MEM, but yet be suspiciously missing during certain points of the storyline, right? Until AJ Styles finally gets his world title shot at a big pay-per-view, and here's where all the fanboys think is the end of the storyline. AJ wins the world title, right? Wrong. Rhino beats the shit out of AJ Styles, costs him the world title, and it turns out to be this big swerve where Rhino was with the main event faction the whole time, and he was put in as a plant in the front line to be the knockout blow. And this puts the front line and the young guys completely on the run. The Empire strikes back. What are the good guys going to do, right? And this is where the storyline's going to get really interesting, because I would not have the story end with AJ Styles. I would not have him be the one that wins the world title, because that's too WWE. It's too simple. It's too obvious. Instead, I would have developing and layered storyline involving someone else rising from the ranks to lead the epic takedown of the main event faction. True storyline. Storyline allowed to mature. Not fast, not simple, not obvious, but epic. Do you remember what that's like? Remember to get your shirt.